Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to Secure World Foundation's display of our Space Sustainability Research Fellow research from 2024. My name is Victoria Samson. I'm the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability for the Secure World Foundation. The Secure World Foundation is a nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. And our mission is to work with all stakeholders to develop and promote ideas and actions to achieve the secure, sustainable, and peaceful uses of outer space. Sometimes in the course of our work, we come across ideas or rationales that are misconstrued or less understood. And so we like to have these ideas underpinning space sustainability further researched and examined. And that's part of this program. So the Secure World Foundation's Space Sustainability Research Fellowship, that's where we identify researchers who are tasked and required to answer questions regarding one or more fundamental concepts underpinning space sustainability. Joining me today is Charlie J.P. Bennett, a legal research officer in the European law at the Space Court Foundation. His research focuses on European and EU space law, particularly its constitution, defense, and security aspects. His research that we had him do is the evolution of treaties from concept to birth, how are arms control treaties made. It is available on our website. The link will be in the comments in the chat. And so today, Charlie will be discussing his research, how he approached it, and his findings. And we're looking forward to having a great conversation between me and him, but also we're looking forward to having a conversation between you and him. So please feel free to send questions through the chat. So just a few housekeeping notes. As I said, if you have questions, put it in the chat. Please be aware this, it's a webinar, but just make sure everyone knows this is being recorded and will be posted on our website later on. If you are interested in closed captioning, it is available on YouTube. And just a couple other housekeeping notes. I would not be a Secure World employee if I didn't share information about a couple of our publications that are available on our website that I think are very relevant to today's conversation. One is our Handbook for New Actors in Space. The second edition was just released. It's available online at our website. The URL should also be in the chat. It goes over best practices and norms for all space actors if they want to do things in a responsible manner. As well, we have our annual Global Counterspace Threat Assessment, which looks at from an unclassified perspective at counterspace capabilities being developed around the world. But that's not what you're here for. You're here for to listen to Charlie and his findings and his research. So I'm going to turn over to Charlie now. Charlie, you're on.
Thank you very much, Victoria, and welcome to everybody. And I just checked that the PowerPoint will be coming up soon. But thank you for joining at the end of what has been a fascinating journey into the arms control production process and arms control generally as a field in the production of this report. And it is one which I hope has produced something of genuine use to the arms control community, whether that be practitioners and scholars alike. Nearly 80 pages long. It details at the most macro level how arms control treaties are made. And in this presentation, I'll of course detail some of the key takeaways from this report, but of course, there's plenty more detail within the document itself, so please feel free to go and read it. Next slide, please, Robert. Firstly, a little word about purpose and methodology. The two questions were, and I've shortened these a little bit, the full can of course be found in the report, but they are essentially, one, what is the developmental process of arms control treaties? And two, what areas and factors are susceptible to arms control treaty making? What makes them more likely to succeed, and what perhaps makes them less likely to succeed? To tackle this, we had three lines of attack. Firstly, of course, a review of the literature, although that's listed second there. Secondly, a review of treaty factors, and to do this, we picked 10 of the quote-unquote most successful treaties, reflecting a variety of factors, including the sort of effectiveness that has been found within literature, but also ensuring a range of different types of treaties, whether that be from nuclear treaties to arms treaties to other weapons of mass destruction, and also other factors like bilateral and multilateral treaties. So a range of instruments to ensure that all of these factors are represented. And the factors we looked at are very numerous. I can't, of course, list them, but they include, for instance, the number of negotiation sessions, how long these sessions lasted, who was involved, and who first proposed the instrument. And we did this, of course, to identify any patterns between all of these successful instruments. And finally, the third line of attack, and actually the primary avenue of this research, was the interview series. I interviewed over 20 negotiators, ambassadors, arms control professionals, and academics, all of whom were highly knowledgeable about the arms control developmental process, or were actually involved in the production of these processes themselves. I cannot thank these individuals enough. It was a pleasure and genuine inspiration to meet every single one of them, and we're lucky enough that some of them are with us here right now. You know who you are. So what was the task? Or that was the task, rather. What did we find? Next slide, please, Robert. On the first question, the developmental process of arms control treaties, and this is the largest question by a significant margin, let me first lay out some of the broader conclusions. Firstly, perhaps the key takeaway, and I'll revisit it at the very end as well, is that these instruments should be viewed as part of a continuous process, a so-called ongoing conversation, as one interviewee specifically put it, and not as isolated instruments. This is important because it results in certain perspectives that explain other behavior with regards to them. For instance, that these instruments can affect each other, especially when they are interacted within the same area. And secondly, that such instruments can be quite literally decades in the making, going through several informal proposals first before sort of solidifying in one that eventually, hopefully, becomes viable. They are furthermore very dynamic in the way that they're made, and as of course the report will detail, there are many different factors that go into their production, but they are very technical in nature, and this perhaps sets them apart from other types of treaties in the sense, in the first place, that a majority of their work that is achieved through their negotiation is achieved in small groups within these negotiations, and not necessarily just these grandstanding large events between states themselves. Next slide, please, Robert. Further, next slide, please. Yes, there we go. Furthermore, there are a great range of actors, of course, that go into arms control treaty production, and the obvious ones are stated there on the slides. But there are also certain others, including, for instance, external advisors, certain domestic policy teams, and the interaction of different domestic departments, that can influence this quite significantly, especially at different points. And what the report details quite minutely is that these roles vary quite substantially in the level of their influence depending on the stage of the negotiations and where in the process it is. For instance, civil society is perhaps a lot more influential at the end and to some extent the beginning of the process, as opposed to the middle, with exceptions, of course. And in keeping with the ongoing conversation aspect I mentioned earlier, it is further clear that continuous dialogue is required to preserve these instruments. The form of this can vary, and this may range from dedicated review mechanisms to bilateral consultations or even civil events. The point is that they are necessary to ensure the instrument's continued efficacy and that people and states alike keep them as part of the conversation that allows and in many cases gives them effectiveness in the first place. It is indeed possible for powerful norms to be formed from such processes, even if, or even without entry into force, as is the case of the CTBT, of course. And it's difficult to state in every case whether or not it is the treaty that crystallizes the norm or whether it merely reflects a pattern of behavior that already existed. But if at all the former, it is clear that the more states that are on board, the better, and indeed that there is a critical mass of states that is required for this to happen in the first place. Next question, please, or next power slide, please, Robert. Yes, thank you. And then also with question 2, this is what areas and factors are susceptible or make treaty making more or less likely, to recap a little bit from earlier. And is in the first place, of course, far easier to identify evidence in favor of a factor as opposed to against it. and this is reflected in the detail of the findings, as you'll see in the report, because it's quite difficult to prove a negative, especially with limited information, as of course this field is, given its sensitivity. But as you can see on the slides, factors that help arms control development, and in some cases are quite essential actually for them to come into existence, include they are reactive, or the fact that they are reactive, they react to a disaster or an imminent threat. They usually concern, not every single time, but almost always concern weaponry that it is at least to some extent obsolete. A humanitarian narrative can sometimes help their existence, and although this is a complicated factor between these two factors, or a complicated relationship rather, the high stakes game of weapons of mass destruction also gives a higher likelihood in many cases. Factors that hinder include the complexity that arises from certain technologies that are dual use. Verification regimes, especially ones that are intensive, also make the existence of such instruments or their emergence less likely, as are perceptions of exclusion on the parts of certain groups of states, or indeed an ambiguous strategic impact. In other words, why do I care? Next slide, please, Robert. Those were some of the main findings, and perhaps one slightly odd part to include in the report, but one that I think is salient, is the author's perspective. As I started, as many people perhaps joining or whatever are skeptical of the arms control system, and indeed it's difficult not to be within the current political climate. But as I conducted more and more of interviews and met the people that were working in this field and heard their perspectives and their experience on this, I actually grew to be more optimistic. It is certainly true that we are in, and there are difficult periods within the field of downturns, let's say, of where no arms instruments are able to be made. But as I stated at the beginning, the gestation period of especially successful arms control treaties is decades in the making. And thus persons many years from now may be reliant upon the work that is being done right now around the world, whether that be within state laboratories and think tanks or government apparatus, but also in the academic and civil actors that feed into these public ones. And thus I will end on the message that the work of this field is still not even potentially, but critically important, and should not be in any way dismissed merely due to a short-term or perhaps isolated mindset. As I said at the beginning, they should be viewed as ongoing conversations. And I'm not saying that these factors are a recipe for ACT success, but the report does show perhaps how to make best with what we currently have. So thank you all so much. I welcome any questions if there is time, and back to you, Victoria. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Charlie. Just fascinating research. And again, reminder to the audience, if you have any questions, please feel free to put in the chat. I have time, so if no one has any, I can do it. But, I was really curious, you went over very briefly the factors that were conducive to arms control treaties, but maybe you could dig down a little bit more and explain, what you meant by those things. And maybe what was one factor conducive to arms control treaty making that you were surprised about?
Well, what I mean by, thanks for the question, firstly, and what I mean by factors that are conducive are sort of elements that are part of the characteristics of a specific instrument, whether that be, for instance, the fact that it is something that concerns weapons of mass destruction, or perhaps it's something that is formed with a specific narrative in mind that makes it more likely, at least on the evidence that I have seen, that it can be actually negotiated in terms of final text and enacted in the first place, although that also isn't considering how effective and such instruments may be after they enter into force or are adopted. But for instance, one of the findings that the humanitarian aspect, for instance, this humanitarian narrative that exists in some treaties and doesn't in others. This isn't a total blanket statement, of course, but it does seem to be the case that if in these negotiations and especially at the start, and this is where civil actors and others can have a potentially big difference, is that with such things in mind, it is easier for more states to get on board with the concerns of what the treaty is attempting to solve. And so for that reason, in many cases, I have found that not only are more states able to join, but or it gives them a reason to care about this, for many other purposes that may be strategic in nature, but also maybe reputational in nature. So it's a very complex relationship, but it is a concordant factor, I would say. Yeah.
Definitely, that makes sense. And maybe let's flip that question. You went briefly over factors that hinder the development of arms control treaties. What
Mm.
one really jumps out at you as a major factor that can slow these down or even stop them from evolving?
Well, I'm perhaps a little biased in this case because a lot of my European research focuses actually on dual use aspects, which is something, and this is the Secure World Foundation I'll just briefly mention, is something that is particularly salient in the context of space security and arms. But as is detailed quite extensively in the report, it does seem, and I've cited some fantastic literature from Dr. Jane Feynman, who essentially proved that the presence of such dual use characteristics can really significantly hinder the chances of a treaty even being formally adopted, let alone negotiated successfully and enacted and entering into force. So that's one aspect, but I would encourage everybody to see what I've said about the other aspects as well, of course.
Oh, definitely. We want everyone to read this paper, not just hear this thing. And I will point out there's a lovely executive summary as well that I think really captures a lot of the main topics in this paper. I want to ask you probably a self-involved question right now. The Secure World Foundation is a nonprofit. We're part of civil society. And you briefly went over the role that civil society can play in supporting these arms control treaty development, but maybe you could dig down a little bit more and explain more about what you found out over the course of the research. You went through the various phases of this development. Which phase is most helpful and what can we do?
Yeah, fantastic question, and one that I hope that can be answered not only with respect to civil society, but also other aspects or other actors, rather, in terms of where they're most effective. Well, what I would say is that certainly outside of the nuclear context, this applies. Within the context of nuclear weapons, it is very difficult, and in fact, from interviewee testimony and treaty analysis, there is very little that civil society can do to influence what happens with these instruments, partly because they're almost always bilateral, but even in the ones that aren't, it has been shown, and I have seen and I have heard testimony that indeed that the extent of influence of civil society in those cases is zero. Outside of that context, outside of the nuclear and weapons of mass destruction context, it depends on where in the negotiations you're talking about. So, for instance, during the negotiations, it seems to be pretty minimal outside of very specific instances, such as the Ottawa Treaty, although there is some argument to say that this is becoming more common, although its effectiveness is certainly debated. There is more influence, I would say, certainly at the very beginning, in terms of civil society's ability to induce the creation of arms control treaties. For instance, one specific mechanism that was stated by an interviewee is that they can induce confidence in, let's say, medium size or even larger as well, and smaller states, confidence that other states may actually support a proposal and that they can actually start a proposal that is at least somewhat politically viable and show that it can be viable. But primarily, I would say that civil society can be, well, it is most effective, I would say, after adoption of the text and entry into force, because, well, after entry into force, they can act as an independent means of ensuring that compliance, or at least keeping tabs on whether or not this is true and the political consequences that may follow, which is very helpful considering the fact that having a verification mechanism makes it harder to make a successful or an arms control treaty at all. But also they can be and have proven to be very good at building support in other states for further ratification, showing them the political benefits that they may have as a result of joining this treaty, the security benefits that may result from this, and all the dynamics that some states may be simply ignorant of. So yeah, they certainly have a very big role to play, but not so much in the middle, rather at both ends.
Well, that's good to know that there's a possibility for us to be able to help out. And obviously, we want to do where it makes sense and most useful times. We're getting some questions from the audience. I'm going to turn over to that really quickly. There's one from Divi Garbishani, where they ask, norms are often shaped in the aftermath of a crisis that is not in the interest of major powers. So what is the relevance of normative instruments in shaping tangible change in the behavior of all stakeholders?
Well, that's a difficult question. It's a little bit beyond the scope of the treaty because we're looking at, or more looked at, how those norms form as opposed to the extent to which they remain applicable afterwards. One thing to say on this particular topic is that to actually revisit the question I just said about, or the question that Victoria asked with respect to civil society, that indeed is an instance of where those actors can be particularly important. When there are these crises, and in order to get an objective assessment of certain situation of whether certain things are being complied with or not, that can be very important, I would say. I'll leave the answer there. Yeah.
Great, thank you. And I just want to remind everyone that this research is available on our website. And I think we're going to put up a slide really quickly. There it is. That shows the name of the research. Again, Evolution of Treaties from Conception to Birth, How Are Arms Control Treaties Made? It's available. There's a QR code you can scan, and the URL is also in the chat. One thing I wanted to ask you about, Charlie, is you spoke to researchers from various parts of the world. And I'm curious if there was a different attitude towards the evolution of arms control treaties when you're talking to representatives of the global South, as opposed to US and Western allies.
Well, that's a very interesting question. I would say in most cases, the answers, at least with the standardized questions that I asked, and they're often very technical about the negotiation progress and things, they aren't necessarily that different. Where they do differ is perspective, and there are certainly some issues that are very, very important for the global South that are not really on the radar of, or not on the radar, but are considered less important, let's say, than by representatives from the West. And I'm sort of generalizing a little bit there because I didn't always ask these things specifically, but for instance, and this is partly also why I say that they should be viewed from a perspective of a continuous conversation between instruments of similar type, not only as isolated ones. Because, for instance, what became clear upon multiple instruments or multiple conversations with members of the global South is that the so-called grand bargain, right, made by the Non-Proliferation Treaty, the deal that was essentially made between the nuclear powers, which mostly includes the West, and the non-nuclear powers, was that there would be a move towards disarmament, and that gradually the nuclear threat would come down in exchange for them not pursuing their own weapons. And the impression of the global South members was absolutely crystal clear, is that there is a increasing idea and impression that this isn't being lived up to, which is hopefully something that I really hope I've emphasized sufficiently within the report. And it is something that not only concerns the nuclear and weapons of mass destruction context, but also, other branches of arms control. The logic being that, well, if you're not, if there is a general decline towards the ability of groups of states to adhere in this context, then why should we believe them with respect to others? So the whole thing can have a very detrimental effect and what would you say, a chilling effect, perhaps. It's arguable. You can't necessarily say that we are seeing the sharp effects of that yet, but I certainly wouldn't rule out that that is an issue that has to be solved and at the very least talked about more so than it currently is. So yeah, I'll leave that there.
Right. And I think that really ties in the finding that you had that this is part of a long conversation, right? This is not a one and done type thing. Discussions in one venue, as you found out, really shape and either propel or repel discussions in other venues. And so I think it's really important to approach this with a holistic viewpoint when you're looking at these things. One of the things that just came up in the chat, and I want to go over really quickly in the few minutes we have left, you put together this insane database where you looked at the 10 arms control treaties and the various phases. Could you talk a little bit about the sort of things you included and how you view these sort of things? I want to make sure people are aware it's a fantastic resource for anyone who wants to do a deep dive into these particular arms control treaties.
Well, thank you for that. And certainly it's well, putting aside the question of the selection of treaties, which I think you're not going for specifically in this case, but what kind of factors were included and why. And well, it was essentially informed from literature and the first few interviews that I did, because of course the size of it changed a little bit. Certain things were merged if they had what is essentially the same information. But the question put to me was to see in as minute detail as possible what it is and what are the details that underpin how these instruments are formed. So to some extent, it was simply how many relevant factors are there and can I put all of them into one database? So that was really without to be a little sort of not crass exactly, but simplistic. That was the underlying methodology of it: is can we get as much information as possible to see really where any patterns, if there are any, exist in the formation of these treaties. To go on a little bit more about, because it's also important about the instruments themselves and why they were selected. Firstly, we're limited in terms of time. It's just me doing this, of course, and there's I wouldn't be able to view or review every single treaty, but literature gave indications that there were certain treaties that were more complied with than others, ones that were more effective than others, ones that had a bigger effect in terms of making the world a safer place. And it was essentially a combination of those factors plus ensuring that a range of different types of treaties was also reflected. So as I said previously, nuclear, non-nuclear, bilateral, multilateral, coalition, those kind of aspects. So yeah, that was really the underlying of it. Oh, and I wanted to say this earlier, but if anybody, and I can see that there's a lot of questions, and obviously we won't get to all of them, but if you have a question that I haven't answered, please get in touch. I would happily talk about this all day. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I could too. But we only have a few more minutes, but just really great questions coming in the chat. So I'm hoping people bear with us while we go a little long. One is from Aditya Ramathan, who asked, how do bilateral arms control treaties differ from multilateral ones in their development?
Very good question. Well, I mean, first of all, obviously when you're talking about bilateral treaties, they concern only two states, right? And as one interviewer pointed out to me, you can, and I say this in the report as well, you can sort of separate treaties or arms control treaties into instruments that are sort of quid pro quo, that usually have a very strategic underpinning, They're not usually humanitarian. The nuclear treaties, especially between the US and Russia, or the USSR, indeed, that is a very different process from a multilateral instrument that is humanitarian focused and wants to build a normative force, let's say, out of that instrument. So it's difficult to put quickly, but they are very, very different, very, very different. The actors that are involved are very different. The negotiation process is relatively different. There are maybe more similarities there than anywhere else because they're very technical. As I said at the beginning, it is necessary that there are small groups of individual diplomats that really hash out, and even as some interviews said, go line by line in terms of how, or word by word even, in how these instruments are formed, and that is common amongst all of them. But the rest is, I think that's really only at least off the top of my head, that's the only factor that stands out as being similar. The rest is very different.
Right, and actually that raises a question that I had, kind of a quick follow-up. One of the things that your findings I thought was so interesting was the role of the individual diplomats and the role of, working group chairs and that sort of thing. You always think of these treaties, these discussions as being between states, but the role of the individual really came out in this. And I was hoping you could dig down more and explain a little bit about that.
Yeah, great question. Well, there's certainly a lot to say here, and for the purposes of this question, I'm going to exclude the chairperson, who is often a diplomat and has other duties and things, but that's a distinct actor, and I make that distinction in the report itself. It is certainly true that the individual diplomats can have a significant difference, but to a point. It's almost as if there's a glass ceiling, because of course they can't contradict their own state's position. If the position of the government is that they want to push for something, it's not like that the individual diplomat can undermine this, or conversely, if a state doesn't want certain provisions in, it's not like the diplomat can undermine that either. And indeed, as one interviewee pointed out to me, and that as is cited in some literature within the report, there have been instances of quite intense rows between diplomats, especially between certain countries that are known to have disagreements, whether, I can't say for some whether security had to be called, but intense arguments. But nonetheless, there can be, and when it really comes to the crunch, the individual diplomat can, it seems, have a very significant role if they are skilled enough, for instance, to really weave through the different different blockades and hindrances that may be in the way of an actual agreement, whether that be a specific part of the text or the text as a whole. It was pointed out to me several times by people I interviewed who are current diplomats actually themselves, that even with some very sort of tightly constraining, tight language given by states in terms of instruction of what they will allow and what they will not, skilled diplomats can have a way of weaving through this and can really be innovative in their approaches to certain questions and their interpretations of things, and thus I wouldn't go so far as to say they are essential, but it is certainly true that a skilled diplomat can make the entire process certainly finish quicker than it otherwise would have. And I'll stop that there. I think that's enough. Yeah.
I know it's hard because, amount of work and thought you put in this, I'm sure you could talk for hours about any of these questions. I wanted to next ask a question from Ria Sedaris, who asked, could you elaborate on the point you made, which was how dual-use technologies specifically complicate the process of treaty adoption? I'm particularly interested in understanding the key challenges and potential solutions in this context.
Well, excellent question. To be clear, it's not specifically to do with treaty adoption, let's say, if we're isolating that from the rest of the process. The more difficult part is the negotiation part. And I would encourage you to read, I cannot remember, it was from 2023, a paper by Dr. Jane Feynman and Dr. Tristan Folper, I think, from, I forget which university, one on the east coast of the US, but I think it's probably my favorite article ever, and it's a fantastic piece, where essentially it shows that in the presence of dual-use technology, the intrusiveness that is required to have any kind of agreement that can be verified in any way is too ambiguous, let's say. Dual-use technology is by its very nature, well, I'm simplifying a little bit here, of course, because there are certain ways you can take apart the dual-use definition into certain parts, whether or not they are dual use in terms of simultaneous function or either or function, and besides the point. But the point is that it makes it very difficult for states that are especially untrustworthy of each other to agree to treaties that contain this kind of technology. It's a very complicated aspect, but I would, to whoever asked that question, I would encourage you to go read that article. It's fantastic, and it proves essentially what I'm saying.
Great, thank you. We'll see if we can dig up the name of the article and put it in the chat in just a minute. There's a really interesting question from Nadezhda Stoyanova, who asks, what insight did you gain on treaty verification mechanisms? How does being able to verify the behavior impact treaty development?
That's a very interesting question. Well, firstly, let's pick apart a little bit about what treaty verification is. Where you have, it can range from, in the case of, for instance, the forces in Europe, or the conventional forces in Europe treaty, the verification mechanism is, as was pointed out by one interviewee who was part of it, looking at a picture and identifying that's a tank, that's a weapon, that's this, that's that, and having that a segment of that across the front line and determining from a central point whether or not that meets the requirements of the treaty or not. And then you have other verification regimes that can include looking into the nuclear warheads or nuclear silos of nuclear missiles. That those kind of verification mechanisms have existed. I'm just reading the question one more time. Yes, and the effect that this has is that if the verification regime is included or is being pushed for, let's say, to be as part of the treaty, then it's more difficult to conclude the instrument, generally speaking, of course, simply because it is a very contentious topic. You're putting in extra contentiousness into an area that is already contentious, and states are understandably very wary about giving others access in any form, really, to their own technologies and things. And this makes it less likely that they're going to agree to it. It's less likely that states are going to see eye to eye on this, that they're going to say, we are both going to allow this kind of intrusiveness, because they are intrusive exercises. If they're on a military compound and things, there is data and evidence and other pieces of information that any verifying officer will be able to see and report back to their own state to. So it is, to a degree, it is the fact that they can reveal certain secrets. Some treaties have gotten around this. For instance, the Chemical Weapons Convention, which, as I mentioned multiple times in the report, is almost a total outlier. It shouldn't exist, yet it does, in terms of what weighs against it and how it should have been formed, and the fact that it is here. But they managed to get around that through a very, very complicated and long thought out and over decades developed verification mechanism. But again, that's an isolated one. And I'll finish by saying that the more general point is that if you have a verification mechanism that you want as part of the treaty, it'll be more difficult to negotiate partly because it's more complex, but also because it introduces a level of intrusiveness that states don't particularly want or want to avoid within such agreements in such sensitive areas.
Great, thank you. And while you were answering that last question, our crack comms team tracked down the Jane Vineman paper that you mentioned. It's available in the chat, but just for those of you listening online, it's Jane Vineman and Tristan Volpe, Dual Use Deception, How Technology
Yes,
Shapes
that's it.
Cooperation, International Relations, and International Organization, put out in 2023. And both the name and
Yep.
the URL are in the chat. It's a great resource, so definitely check it out. I think it's relevant to this conversation. One of the things I wanted to ask is from one of my colleagues, Chris Johnson, who said, I wanted to know if you have specific advice for governments seeking to pursue arms control agreements. And is that advice different for major powers versus middle powers?
Oh, that's a very good and a tough question. One that you could certainly find the question to in the report itself, and is quite complicated to lay out off the top of my head, but I'll do my best. Well, certainly the advice to be given between major powers and middle powers is different. In many cases, as the report details, and depending, of course, on the exact area or type of treaty that you're talking about, you often need a champion state that is at least, or group thereof, it can also be a group, a so-called coalition of the willing that is later expanded to a multilateral effort. Excuse me. But yeah, so first of all, you need, in most cases, I would say, a powerful actor, not necessarily you couldn't say definitively they have to be a nuclear power or a Security Council member or something like this, but we're thinking of that kind of area. There has to be those kind of, at least one of those, preferably a group of those kind of states that propose such an instrument, whether or not they're borrowing it from another, or at least be part of it, in order to champion the initiative, because otherwise other states simply don't listen. And another thing to perhaps highlight is, in the midst of quite limited resources of the smaller states, that's also the reason why it's not only about desire or moral imperative, let's say. It's simply a fact of resources, that such states are more able to push such things within international multilateral fora, that they're necessary to have those on board. And then so they can, those kind of states can include major and middle power states, depending on how you pick it apart. And then in the smaller states, there is, as I detail in the report, certainly evidence that having a sort of group that is already banded together with a specific idea and they can be informed by civil society, by the way. They can convince some of the larger states to champion a specific initiative and thereby get their way. So it's not necessarily, for the sake of getting these things through, it's not always helpful for anyone with a good idea to just go for it. There has to be a lot of behind the scenes work in terms of what is effective. But to get more to the crux of what I think Mr. or Dr. Johnson is getting at, the major powers that are seeking a arms control instrument should do their very best to consolidate a group, but also to make sure that it is a viable strategic instrument, let's say, or political. It's very hard to say that definitively, because there's so many different factors that go into it. But the best thing perhaps they could do is form that kind of coalition of the willing, and we've seen that, especially in the 90s, but also outside of that is possible, and you do get treaties that way. For less powerful states, I would advise, rather, again, similar sort of things, but to also lobby specific bigger states in order to get those opinions across, and also to so it goes both ways instead of one way. The bigger states can expand outwards, and the middle powers should lobby both above and below at the same time. Of course, it depends on the exact area that you're talking about. But since we're including the lower powers, they're going after sort of multilateral, perhaps humanitarian focused type of treaty, that sort of, targeting both at the same time would be the best avenue to go, and is the one that gets the most success, and is also the one where civil society can help the most, I would say, because they have limited means to do so, but nonetheless, they can really build this critical mass if the work is done over literally many decades, by the way. This isn't an overnight thing. It takes years for this to happen, but over a period of time, that method can also be very successful, I think, yes.
Right. I think in your paper, you talked about how for smaller countries that may not have the resources, civil society can help in terms of providing subject matter expertise, capacity building, that sort of thing, and helping bolster up where needed. And we are way over time. I really, it's been a great conversation, and I don't want to hold everyone hostage too much longer. But kind of looking ahead, right now, this April, the UN is kicking off an open-ended working group on the prevention of arms race in outer space and all its aspects. And while it's not necessarily treaty negotiation, it is arms control discussions. So I'm wondering, based on your research and what you've learned, what advice would you give to the diplomats about to kick off that conversation?
Well, the first thing, and I think it's a critically important point, is this dual use aspect, because that, and again, I'm being a little biased here because that's the focus of a lot of my research and this kind of thing, but this is actually especially true in the space domain. This is really the issue, I believe, that would sort of make or break it. Well, not make or break it exactly, but it's the issue that is most likely to hinder this. And as I also detail in the expectations of individual diplomats and these kind of sections, there is an expectation of knowing the underlying dynamics of this, and this is one of the most important dynamics for sure. So every diplomat should, and whoever's there, should go in knowing that is one of the most important areas, and the nuances that come about it, because it's not a totally insurmountable factor, but it is a very important one. And of course, it is in those discussions, but it needs to be even more, in my opinion, because it's such a large factor that will affect whether or not those arms discussions are successful. And secondly, another important factor is to realize that, well, for instance, so let's put it this way, one of the things I was told by several ambassadors, actually, and former diplomats, is that part of the reason that many space regimes failed in the 60s and 70s, putting aside the dual use factor, although that wasn't as potent back then, actually, part of the reason they failed is because and this is the factor in question too that I refer to as an ambiguous strategic impact. In other words, what is in it for us? Because it wasn't self-evident. It's a bit more evident now, but it wasn't evident then. What is in it for the smaller states, for the even middle power states? What is in it to support these kind of regimes for the space domain? Because they have such limited resources. Why should they push so hard for something where it isn't self-evident that the benefits would come to them straight away? But it is clear that with the direction and the development of everything, that space is the future, and that all countries have a stake in it, and thus it is in the interest of every state in order to get this over the line. And of course, the Secure World Foundation and other civil actors have been pushing for that. But that should be encouraging thought. Let's say that there is a difference between now and the failures of the past. So that should be hopefully encouraging, but we will of course see how that all pans out.
A lot can change, and I think my big takeaway that I found very encouraging, actually, from your research, was that this is a long conversation. These discussions and treaties, they're seeding the ground months, years, even decades before the final fruition into an actual document and something that's proliferated and followed. And so I think it's easy to be discouraged if you're taking the short-term view. We had this meeting and we didn't come to consensus. But if you say, okay, long-term, we're building the blocks and getting agreement, and we're working our way towards a final agreement, whether that's a treaty or non-legally binding but common approach, norms of behavior, what have you. I think that's encouraging. Just have the long view on this.
Exactly.
But, yeah, so that was that made me feel a little better about this whole process.
It's critical, if I may add. It's literally critical. If there was this kind of complacency or skepticism in the 40s and 50s, when the Biological and Chemical Weapons Convention verification regimes and all of this research that was being done that would underpin these regimes later on wasn't being done during those decades, then we would never have gotten those instruments in the first place. Simple as that. So anybody who works in it, keep doing what you're doing. It may not work now, it may not work in the next 10 years, but there probably will be at some point a viable political opportunity to get some kind of agreement. Indeed.
Right. When the stars are aligned, we need all the things in place so we can move ahead. So great. Well, thank you so much for your research again. Charlie's paper, The Evolution of Treaties from Conception to Birth, How Our Arms Control Treaties Made, is available on Secure World Foundation's website. I'd like to thank the audience for their active participation and fantastic questions. And thank you, Charlie, for your fantastic research. Looking forward to continuing this conversation. Again, this webinar has been recorded. It'll be available on our website shortly. Again, the Secure World Foundation focuses on all issues affecting space sustainability, security, and stability. And so we welcome the audience to participate and contribute to future conversations. So thank you all very much. Appreciate you coming and looking forward to seeing you again. Bye, everyone.